Hello everyone, this is Luis Quintanilla. We're going to start our webinar shortly. Thank you for joining us. Okay, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. We're gonna start now our webinar. My name is Luis Quintanilla. I'm a junior fellow from the International and Institute-wide Initiatives Department at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and I would like to welcome everybody to this afternoon's webinar titled "Urban Property and Land Taxation in Argentina: The Challenge of Decentralization," hosted by the Lincoln Institute. Today, I will serve as your moderator in this session. And before introducing our speakers, as a preamble to their presentation, I would like to note that this webinar is part of the Lincoln Institute's series of programming in support of our global municipal fiscal health campaign. This campaign was launched in 2015 to help restore local government's capacity to provide basic goods and services and plan for the future. We have been carrying out the campaign by mobilizing new research and developing tools and programs to promote fiscal health domestically and internationally. And while the causes of fiscal stress are complex, We know that land can play a significant role for metropolitan regions in both the maintenance of basic city services and the funding of infrastructure. So at the Lincoln Institute, we have identified 6 pillars of municipal fiscal health that provide a framework to advance financial solutions across different levels of government. And 2 of those pillars that we identify as contributing factors to sound fiscal systems and relevant in these presentations are number 1, land-based revenues, and 2, a multi-level governance. And so in this, the third installment in our webinar series, we seek to educate us about the magnitude of the property tax and land taxation challenge in Argentina, specifically. Presenters in this session will show the findings of their working paper, which include an analysis of the fiscal policy reforms that are intended to reduce current imbalances between own source revenues and expenditures at both the central and the subnational government levels. It is my pleasure now to introduce our speakers for the webinar who will cover these topics: Cynthia Goytia and Marcela Cristini, both professors and members of the Urban Policy and Housing Research Center at the Torcuato Di Tella University in Buenos Aires, Argentina. I'm going to mention their biographies next. So starting with Cynthia Goytia. Cynthia is the head of the Master of Science in Urban Economics at Torcuato Di Tella University in Buenos Aires, Argentina, where she also chairs the Urban Policy and Housing Research Center, the leading research institution in Latin America specialized in urban policies. She develops a relevant body of academic research focused on the evaluation of the impacts of urban policies, from infrastructure to land and housing programs. She is passionate in the assessment of the territorial, economic, and social effects that derive from public policies. Her research involves innovative tools such as big data analytics and a persistent aim to develop interactive web tools to increase the public's understanding of research results and more informed policy decisions by governments. Cynthia lectures at University of Cambridge, London School of Economics, and the Institute of Housing Studies. She is a visiting scholar at Harvard University since 2016 and a fellow to the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. She is also a consultant to Latin American and Argentina's governments, the World Bank, the United Nations, the Inter-American Development Bank, and to Banca de Desarrollo de América Latina, also known by its acronym CAF. Cynthia holds a Master of Science in Urban Economics and a PhD from the London School of Economics and Political Science in the United Kingdom. Marcela Cristini is an invited researcher and member of the Urban Policy and Housing Research Center and a professor at Torcuato Di Tella University. Since 1980, she has been a senior economist at the Latin American Research Economic Foundation, a private think tank based in Buenos Aires, where she has acted as a technical coordinator and co-director of research projects. Her main fields of expertise are housing finance and urban economics and international economics. Since 1988, she has also developed consultancy work for the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and the United Nations Development Program. Since year 2000, Marcela has developed a series of studies on housing financing for the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, and local organizations and governments. Currently, Marcela is also a member of the Council of International Economic Relations, CARI. Welcome, Cynthia and Marcela. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation by them for approximately 35 minutes, followed by a brief Q&A segment of about 10 minutes. The audience will be on mute for the duration of this webinar, and we ask that you please use the chat function if you would like to submit a question. Following the Q&A portion, we will close our webinar by providing resources and links where you can download publications if you would like to learn more about the topics that we will cover today. So without further ado, I am going to turn the presentation to Cynthia and Marcela. Welcome, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Luis. First of all, I want to thank everybody for joining us in this webinar, and I want to thank especially the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy for their support in this study. So we can go to the first slide. Next slide. Okay, the property tax collection in Argentina, as in other Latin American countries, is much lower than its potential value. Property tax revenue to GDP is 2% on average in OECD countries, 0.6 in developing countries, and 0.28 in Latin American countries, 0.36 in Argentina. At the same time, our cities require significant infrastructure investments to provide basic services to growing populations and expanding urban areas. So we know that land and property constitute an important base for mobilizing revenue to meet all those public service needs. So the objective of this study is to evaluate what are the advantages and disadvantages of decentralizing the collection of the urban property tax from provincial to medium-sized municipal governments in order to increase fiscal revenues. The main advantages by giving local authorities autonomous revenues based on property tax collection include increased fiscal revenues, fostering improved local accountability and responsiveness, and creating large fiscal space for local management of urban development. So, in the rest of this presentation, we will present the feasibility of decentralization and confirm the potential gains that could be accrued through the implementation of this reform. Next slide. So, in first place, we need to know what are the fundamentals for property taxation, or why should we care about local property taxation. We know from the international experience that property taxation remains the greatest way to support local public expenditures because it can contribute stable revenue resources and provides long-term sustainability in public finance for the delivery of key public goods and services. We can highlight three central issues for improving the performance of the property tax. First, economists find the property tax very attractive because it's the most progressive tax, much more than other taxes on consumption that highly affect the poorest households. Those who benefit most from public investments will likely pay a larger share of the tax. Public finance economists favor the property tax, and particularly a land tax, because it increases the intensity of land use and mitigates the incentives for urban sprawl and land retention. Second, since land is immovable, this tax is highly difficult to avoid. It means that it can provide a very stable foundation for locally generated resources to meet local needs. At the same time, the property tax is very familiar to taxpayers. It's not a new tax. Citizens expect to see impact of the taxes they pay in better infrastructure, improved services, and other community improvements. When they do see results that improve their lives, they are more willing to pay their taxes and support local officials. When the results are not apparent, support and willingness to pay can be eroded. However, as in other Latin American countries, we know that much of this potential is still wasted. Two stylized facts are relevant for the analysis of property tax in Argentina. The first one is the importance of this tax has decreased sharply over time. In late 90s, it represented 0.63 of GDP, while in 2013 it was only 0.38 of GDP. Second, the decentralization process of the tax from provinces to municipalities only took place in 7 provinces out of 23 in the country. Next, please. This gives us to the central objective of the study. Why to decentralize the urban property tax to local governments? Well, there are very important gains from bringing government decisions closer to citizens, because it improves their capacity to satisfy the social demands and allows for much more effective accountability. On average, municipalities are in charge of 9% of total fiscal expenditure of the country, while their own total revenue is only 4% of the total fiscal revenues. Moreover, in relation to service provision, in fact, we know that demand for services could increase disproportionately if local users are not taxed to cover the service expenditure. Even urban growth can also be highly inefficient when the choice of services is not based on an accurate perception of their costs, which must be one of the most powerful explanations for the inappropriate and excessive urban extension in many cities in Latin America, and particularly in many cities in Argentina. So, next slide, please. To carry out our goal, we evaluate the feasibility of the centralization of the tax to large and medium-sized cities and assess the potential benefits and cost of this initiative. The methodology is organized in 2 main sections. The first one is devoted to the description of the operation of the property tax in our country, in Argentina, including institutional and administrative details. It also describes the international and particularly the Latin American experience in the property tax decentralization, against which we can compare the Argentine conditions. The second part develops a simulation model for large and medium-sized urban centers in Argentina to assess the benefits and cost of decentralizing the property tax. In those models, we estimate the potential benefits of the centralization, and we compare the revenues collected by the provincial government and a very centralized organization and the ones collected by the municipal government. We also explore what are the sources that can widen the scope of the property tax. So Marcela is now going to continue with our explanation.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Well, as you know, gaining efficiency in tax collection is a primary goal of any administration in a developing country. At the same time, it was pointed out by Cynthia that revenues from the urban property tax are below their potential, and that tax decentralization has shown to be an adequate reform to fulfill the aim of increasing tax collection according to the international experience. Here, we are studying the feasibility of decentralizing this tax in Argentina. But our first step was to review the international and particularly the Latin American experience to construct a framework for comparison of our own results. A synthesis of this analysis is shown in the picture, where the direction of the arrow indicates increasing centralization of the tax, we accommodated the Latin American countries according to the degree of decentralization of this tax. Thus, Mexico, Colombia, Bolivia, and Ecuador are rather decentralized, while Brazil and Argentina are intermediate cases, and Chile is the country that shows more centralization in the operation of the urban property tax. In practice, as a result of the review of the literature, the control of the tax rate by the subnational government is enough to consider it as a decentralized tax. Besides, in practice, the administration of the tax is generally shared between two levels of government, national or regional and local. But there is not a single dominant pattern according to the international evidence. However, depending on the size of the cities, it is possible to identify a common pattern. For medium and small size cities, the cadasters and valuation are centralized at the national or regional level, while local governments only collect the tax. However, in large cities, the valuation is also assigned to the local governments. Thus, we have to take into account this especially. The feasibility and form of the decentralization process depends on the government organization, but also depends on the urban structure of the country. Next slide, please. Now, let's see these features in the Argentine case. Now, we have two features, the layers of the government and the urban structure of the country. Argentina is a federal country, so we have three levels of government: central government, provincial, and municipal government. Besides, at the bottom, at the level of the municipal governments, the number of local governments is very large. We have around 2,000 urban centers in Argentina, and half of them, 1,000, are proper municipalities with authorities elected by the population. Okay? These 1,000 municipalities are the ones that can manage independently a decentralization process. Most of them are small ones with less than 10,000 inhabitants. Now, this may be an obstacle in the process of decentralization. Let's see the next slide. In this slide, we present the 24 provinces in Argentina, including Buenos Aires city, and the bars represent the portion of the housing stock by each province. As you can see, the four first provinces, they represent more than 70% of the housing stock. So when thinking about decentralization of the urban property tax, there you will find the main gains for this decentralization. Numbers on top of the bars, they show the number of municipalities by province. As you can see, very small provinces in terms of housing stock have the same number. For instance, La Pampa, they have the same number of municipalities than big provinces like Buenos Aires, more than 100 municipalities by province. Okay, this is a problem, an obstacle in terms of that we will have to choose what kind of municipal organization we will admit in the decentralization process. Next slide, please. But the benefit is very clear for decentralization is very clear in Argentina. Argentina is subject to a large vertical fiscal imbalance, which means that the central government collects most of the taxes while expenditure responsibility is in hands of the provinces or local governments. On the left side of the chart, you can see the blue area are the revenues corresponding to the central government. And in the right side, you can see the red and green areas are the expenditure corresponding to the provincial and municipal governments. So decentralizing taxes is part of the solution to this imbalance. Next chart, please. We can see now the resources collected at the municipal level. Half of the resources are coming from the provincial level, and half of them are own resources collected by the municipal government. Take a look to the red area in the figure. The red area corresponds to the contributions for local public services. For instance, public lights, garbage collections, they represent 65% of total own resources of municipalities on average, and in many cases they are calculated using the same base and the same method as the one used in the property tax. This creates the possibility of decentralization to these largest municipalities, knowing that they already have a useful instrument to apply in the proceeding of this decentralization. Next slide, please. Now, let's come back a little bit to the importance of the urban property tax in Argentina. The importance of the property tax diminished over time. In the 90s, it represented 17% of total revenues, and at present it is only 7.5% of total fiscal revenues. But this fact has to be interpreted carefully. Why? Because if we go to the other side, remember this chart, please, the diminishing trend in the importance of the tax. Now we go to the next chart, and okay, thank you. And here we can see a different figure. This is the perception by the population about the burden of the tax. The burden of the tax calculated on per capita basis were 400 pesos per capita in the 90s, and in constant terms is almost the same at present. So from the point of view of the public, the burden of the tax is almost the same over time, okay? The reason, how can these two pieces of information be reconciled? After the 90s, Argentina, during the 2000s, Argentina included new taxes that were very distorting taxes, and we are now trying to eliminate them. So due to this increase of revenues provided by these distorting taxes, the importance of the property tax diminished over time. But the problem is that for the public, the burden is almost the same historically. So if we are going to increase the burden of the tax, we will have to make it clear to the public the reasons why we are changing that burden and we are making it larger than in the past. This is a very important point if we want to be successful in the decentralization process. Well, now let's go to the figures we prepare to check the feasibility of decentralization in Argentina in our next slide. To elaborate the figures of the simulation model, we present a very simple definition of the urban property tax in a simple accounting model where the tax revenue equals the number of houses, I mean the cadastre of Argentina, valued at their price as the base of the tax. Then we apply the tax rate, flat or progressive, depending on the province, and we adjust the result according to the effectiveness of the collection. As you know, not everybody pays the bills, the taxes, some maybe, and there are exemptions to the tax. So the tax bill is paid in, let's say, 80–85% of total of the total tax by municipality. Afterwards, we deduce the cost of the collection. It means we deduce the administrative cost in the equation. We calibrated the parameters of the model to adjust to the situation in 2010. And we applied this model to simulate the actual and potential tax collection in 2016. Next slide, please. This chart is only to remember that, once again, we have to stress the fact that population is unevenly distributed in Argentina. So we identified the largest cities by distributing all the municipalities in quantiles according to their housing stock or population is the same. The figure in the chart shows the red line shows the hypothetical evenly distributed population in Argentina, and the green line shows what happens with the real distribution. As you can see, the last quintile is the one that represents almost 75% of the population in Argentina. Next slide. Now we have to compute the simulations. For that reason, we have to estimate the parameters of our very simple model. The parameters are the percentage of the cadastral value of the housing unit taxed. It was fixed in 70%. Tax rate on average was 0.5%. Effective collection 65%. And we included also informal tenure, calculated for each municipality, and the growth, urban growth for each urban center. The value of these parameters were informed by provinces and municipalities through a survey. prepared for this study. How the model operates. Using the accounting model, we simulated changes in each parameter to evaluate the response of the tax collection in the selected cities classified by size. Okay. Next slide. Now, here you can see the main results of our simulations. They are very interesting because each bar shows the gain in percentage of the actual collection of the actual tax revenue. Okay, so if you see the most important gain comes from the increase in valuation. Increase in valuation as a major source of improvement in the collection was an expected result for us, because in Argentina faced during this period an important inflation episode. So it was expected, and it is not. It is interesting, but it is not the most interesting result for our model. Why? Because it was obvious. Instead, take a look at the increase in effective collection if we move the parameter from 65% to 85%. So if we can reduce the inefficiency in collection, if we can achieve more compliance by the public, then, and this is, and the political cost of this action is very low, then we will achieve a 30% increase in the collection of the tax, very similar to the 30% of increasing the tax rate from 0.5% to 0.65%. Imagine the difference in the political cost for a government from being more efficient. It is one achievement that you can get through better organization of your own government, as compared to announcing to the public that the tax rate will be increased. So this result was for us one of the most interesting ones in the exercise, because it shows that decentralization could be a very good instrument to increase the collection in the tax without the political cost of increasing the tax rate. Two other results that are also very important are the gains to accrue from the reduction of informality and from the taxation of urban growth. If you these gains go from 10 to 14%, and they are very important in terms of the possibility of achieving these results through decentralization of of the urban property tax. So, summarizing, we have an obvious result, the increase in valuation in an inflationary country. It is not much interesting, but we have very interesting results in terms of increasing effective collection. This means more efficient governments at the local level could increase revenues without political costs, and the same happens with the gains from taxing urban growth and from taxing and from a reduction of the informal tenure in each municipality. So, summing up in the next slide, we are summarizing the results of our analysis. In Argentina, the collection of the property tax is very responsive to increases in the property valuation, but more interesting, they are responsive to the gains in efficiency in the rate of effective collection, and gains from reduction in the informal tenure and in the possibility of taxing urban growth. Besides, the decentralization of the urban property tax could be considered as a very good first step in the right direction to reduce fiscal vertical imbalance and empower municipalities in order to improve urban development. We are getting resources for the municipalities to improve urban development, and we are taking taxes closer to the public in order to improve accountancy, the accountancy of the municipal governments. So substantial gains can be accrued through the centralization of the tax, but we have to consider that these exercises are valid for medium and large-sized cities in each Argentine province. It is not the same for small cities, small municipalities, because there are scale economies in the collection and in the organization of the tax that have to be taken into account. However, we have a problem in Argentina, that is, we are ready to decentralize the tax, for instance, to 300 municipalities in Argentina. But because they could be able to manage this tax. However, the provinces that potentially concentrate most of the gains will need to implement institutional changes, because their municipal organic laws are not prepared to decentralize all these fiscal operations to the municipal level. So even though we know that decentralization is feasible and it is profitable for the Argentine municipalities, we also know that there are legal procedures that have to be taken into account. So our results show that prudent decentralization of the urban property tax to large and medium-sized cities of Argentina could increase fiscal revenues, gaining efficiency in the tax collection and creating fiscal space for urban development policies with contents and designs closer to population demands. So these results show part of the way, and we hope our authorities will complete at least part of the decentralization process in order to achieve the results, the desired results we have shown. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Cynthia and Marcela, for that terrific presentation. Quite interesting. And now I would like to begin the Q&A segment of our discussion by posing a couple of questions to the two of you. But first, I want to remind our audience to please write your questions using the chat function. We are going to collect all questions that you submit and provide them to Cynthia and Marcela so that they can be aware of all inquiries and hopefully address them separately. Okay, so let's start with a question related to the share of the property tax in fiscal revenues. So we know that the share of the property tax in fiscal revenues can be much higher in developed countries compared to developing countries. So could you explain a little bit more why do you think decentralizing this tax can help close this gap, and maybe explain a little bit more how?
Okay. As we show with this presentation and with this study, there is a big space for improvement in tax collection. First, we know that when the determination of the tax remains centralized, it may undermine the effort to improve the performance of the property tax as a local resource. Second, lack of compliance can be reduced, and we have shown what will be the gains from reducing this lack of compliance. And in this way, local revenues can be used to satisfy local demands and improve accountability. So we expect that this reform, as we show in this presentation, can have important effects in reducing this fiscal gap in revenues when we compare with developing countries. In fact, we show that in previous stages, the property tax collection in Argentina was even more high.
One more thing, there is a gap between developed and developing countries in terms of this tax. The importance is high in developed countries. One reason is that they are wealthy, and for that reason they can tax wealth, and it is a much more important part of their revenues. Instead, in developing countries, in general, we have different taxes. We have indirect taxes on consumption. We do not rely on income tax as much as they do. So the difference will continue to exist, but the gap will be lower, and it will disappear when developing countries along the way of development for developing countries. Okay.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. Now, your study develops the case of the property tax decentralization in a federal country. So to what extent do you think the lessons from the Argentina's case can be useful for countries under a unitary political organization, or with a different structure than federalism for that matter?
Okay, this is a good question because there are only 25 federal countries in the world out of 192 countries recognized by the United Nations. However, many unitary countries have proceeded with the devolution of fiscal attributions to local governments since the 90s. So that in practice, the two organization systems present mixed features. And there is an overlap in the organizations between federal and unitary countries right now, particularly in developing countries. Okay, notice that, for instance, Colombia. I mentioned Colombia as a country that had decentralized the urban property tax, and Colombia is not a federal country. And it was at the same level of Mexico, that is a federal country. So the differences are important, but not so important like in the past. And the benefits of decentralization, particularly in the case of taxes, has been recognized for developing countries, so decentralization has proceeded in many cases, and that's why our lessons can be extended for any kind of political organization in any country.
Okay, great, thank you. Next, why is your study focused on mid-sized and large municipalities as the actors for the decentralization of the urban property tax? Can you explain a little further the way you scoped your study?
Okay, that's a good question too. Well, based on the analysis that we have shown, there are the benefits of decentralization are concentrated in the largest centers. The largest cities in the country still depend on provincial tax collection and provincial tax co-participation for this property tax. So these are provinces such as Córdoba, Buenos Aires, Santa Fe, where the largest municipalities of the country are, and in which, as Marcela has explained, they have granted very limited faculties to their municipalities. So there, decentralization, the benefits or the gain from decentralization would be greater. We are not talking about small municipalities, because in these municipalities, as we show in our study, there are not economies of scale, and the setup cost and the administrative cost will be larger than the benefits that they can accrue by this process of decentralization. But, however, from the legal point of view, in our country, there are almost 400 municipalities that are potentially able to organize their property tax due to the degree of autonomy that they were granted by their provinces. So this means that there are a large group of municipalities where the decentralization process could advance without major needs of any type of institutional reforms. However, some of them, which are quite very small, as Marcela shows, lower than 10,000 inhabitants, will face very large administrative costs that will not offset the revenues from decentralization.
Awesome, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. So just could you briefly elaborate a little further on what are the potential risks of decentralizing the urban property tax for municipalities, perhaps starting within the Argentinian context, and then conclusion for a broader scenario that may apply to other regions as well?
Well, okay. I think we were very clear stating the benefits of decentralizing this tax and some of the obstacles. But there are also, I think there are some risks. For instance, in the Argentine case, we many municipalities are ready for decentralization because they have a proper organization, but many of them instead are not prepared for that, and even large municipalities. So when the process of decentralization is generalized, you can have failures and successes, cases of failure and successes, and you have to understand why the failures are occurring. Because if not, the process of decentralization can be stopped for political reasons. One more thing, so you have to be very sure when you start the decentralization process. You have to make sure that you will have a bunch of very successful cases to show to the rest of the municipalities in order to create the atmosphere for a fruitful decentralization process. One other thing is that we are trying to bring resources closer to the local governments in order to improve the results of the policies, because now the public, the population at the local government will be responsible for the payment of the tax, and they at the same time will know that this tax goes to their local government. So they will make them accountable for the results. Nevertheless, this tax is only a small part of the resources that the municipal government receives every year. And as you may know, at any level in many countries, developing countries, we have problems, corruption problems with connected to fiscal expenditure. So in this sense, the decentralization of this tax cannot change a scenario where corruption is ongoing, because it is a small part, and the accountability of the government because of this tax is only a first step in the process. So you also have a risk you may have is to decentralize to at the moment in which the accountability of municipal governments cannot be assured. So the contribution of decentralizing this tax is not enough to guarantee accountability. And I think this is a lesson for many, many countries in Latin America.
Perfect, very insightful. We are reaching at the end of our session, but I want to thank you so much again, Cynthia and Marcela, and to our audience for joining us today. I think this has been a very interesting session, and we appreciate your participations, and hope you joined. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Before we conclude our webinar, I would like to invite you to visit the Lincoln Institute's website and find publications and resources related to this session, including obviously Cynthia and Marcela's full report on their investigation, which you may find in the working papers section under the publications menu that is on the main page. In addition, we have a number of resources for those who want to learn more about the property tax, including our books Sistemas del Impuesto Predial by Claudia de Cesare, and Good Tax, the legal and policy issues for the property tax by Lincoln Institute Senior Fellow and Chair of the Evaluation and Taxation Department, Joan Youngman. Lastly, I also want to invite you to consider our quarterly magazine, Landlines. You can find all these publications and more at lincolninst.edu/publications. Once again, we thank you for joining us this afternoon, and please stay tuned for upcoming events related to the Municipal Fiscal Health campaign from the Lincoln Institute. Thank you so long.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.